the parent advocate from the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. We want to thank the NEA Big Read. This is the NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment of the Arts in partnerships with Arts Midwest. We also want to give a great shout out to the city of New Haven for Ms. Gretchen Knopf being with us and Ms. Sally Esposito. And Keo also serves on our One City, One Read Advisory Committee. We have our lovely interpreters with us today, Ms. Joy and Ms. Linda. This will be live streamed and it will be up afterward to be watched throughout. I'm going to pass it along to Keo because she is who we are all here to see today. And I hope you enjoy and you take some notes and that you learn something.
Good evening, everyone. I do have handouts of the presentation, so if you want to take a handout and follow along, you can. And then, of course, you can follow on the screen. So the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center is an agency that supports families who have children with special needs, birth to age 26. It's a nonprofit organization, and we're actually celebrating our 40th year. Thank you. It surprises me that folks still don't know that we exist. It is a statewide organization, so we support families throughout the entire state. All of our program staff is either an individual with a disability or we're parents of kids with disabilities. So I have 4 children, 3 who have been in IEPs, 2 currently with IEPs, and 1 with a 504 for different needs from ADHD to autism to hearing loss. Specific learning disability, central auditory processing disorder, so a bunch of stuff. But all of our parents have been at PPTs, know what a PPT is from the parent perspective. So when we support families, not necessarily in the advocate role, but more as consultants. These are our partners. And we receive funding from a variety of sources. The PTI grant, which is the Parent Training and Information grant, is through the U.S. Department of Education. But it also leads us to inroads with other groups within the state. So this is our vision, that all families will have the confidence, knowledge, and understanding that they need to effectively advocate for their children and to partner with professionals to ensure that children and youth grow and learn to their full potential. We strongly believe that parents are their children's best advocate. And then our mission is that CPAC is going to educate, support, and empower Connecticut's diverse families of children and youth with any disability or chronic conditions, age birth to 26, and the professionals who serve them. I want to make sure you guys knew that. All of our services are free. We mostly provide telephone consultation. However, we do provide, like right now, in-service presentations for school personnel and service providers. We provide workshops and trainings. A lot of the trainings, because of COVID or as a result of COVID, have been virtually. However, we are starting to do in-person trainings on different topics related to special education. We also have an e-newsletter for parents and professionals where we try to update with information and resources throughout the state. We also have a website with information on upcoming events, education issues, and local resources, as well as several social media options, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We also have 2 parent support groups, one on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock that we provide fully in Spanish. We also have one on Thursdays at 4 o'clock, which is in English. So the idea for today is that the participants will increase their understanding of the various laws that support students with disabilities, hopefully increase your understanding of the expectation for education benefit, and also increase the understanding of the principles of IDEA. Feel free to ask questions. I would like to make this as engaging as possible, so if I speak too fast, let me know. I can slow down. If you have any questions about the topic, feel free to let me know as well. So these are the laws affecting the education of students with disabilities. So there's Every Student Succeeds Act. Some people call it ESSA. There's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, the McKinney-Vento Act, State of Connecticut regs, and then IDEA. So each one supports students differently, so I'm going to go through all of them. But I do want to point out that the McKinney-Vento Act in particular is not specific to special ed. However, for kids that are experiencing homelessness or unstable housing, instead of having to worry about the student's educational needs, like if the family has to, I don't know, stay with an aunt or an uncle, whatever, they don't have to worry about not being able to go to the school that they were attending. At least that can be a stable place for students, so it's really important. Obviously, the family has to notify the school so they can enact this for the family, but sometimes families don't know and then have to decide, you know, if they have to now register the kid at a different school. But it's really important that families do know this. So with Every Student Succeeds Act, we're going to point out a few things. This is the principal federal law affecting education from kindergarten through high school. Oh, that sounds better. I kind of like that. Sorry. It was signed into effect December 10th of 2015, and it was previously the elementary and secondary education, also known as the No Child Left Behind. It's really important to note that with ESSA, it's going to hold all students to a high academic standard, which is huge, that prepares them for success in college and careers, providing more children access to high-quality preschool. Just so that you know, Connecticut does not have universal preschool, and that becomes an issue, right? Some districts, you know, provide full-day preschool programs, some provide half-day programs. So sometimes for families, having to make that decision is really hard. Also, what I point out there. I'll leave it there. Well, no, I do want to say something about preschool. So there's different options, and the reason why I want to point it out is because I'm thinking now of transition kids that were in birth to 3. So it's really important to think about when the child is going to age out, especially spring and summer birthdays, because if families are thinking they want to apply for magnet lotteries, usually that's done January, February, March. Open choices in April. April 1st is the deadline. So just thinking about that for families, because sometimes they are not prepared for that transition, and then they're left with limited supports. And the reason why I say that is because if they were really thinking they can get their child into a full-day program and ends up in a partial program, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, because that's some of the programs, then that may make a difference of deciding if they're going to allow their child to be in a preschool program or not. And we really want kids to be exposed as much as possible. Obviously, if they do qualify for special ed services, that qualifies under something else. But if the district is only providing a half-day program, then that's what the kid is going to end up getting, a half-day program. They may offer some creative options, but please keep that in mind because some kids may need more than just a partial program. Then I'm going to mention now Section 504. It's a civil rights law, which means that any person, it isn't specific to education, like in high school, in a school setting, but also in college, it could apply towards work. That needs accommodations should be able to access through Section 504, including for work. So it's really important. Section 504 forbids organizations from excluding or denying individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. And what immediately comes to mind, especially as we are approaching the summer, is summer camps. Right? Sometimes kids that are in summer camps are excluded because maybe they need to have certain medication on hand, or maybe because of behaviors and they don't have staffing, or they may have some medical needs. So please keep in mind that this is really important, again, because it isn't just specific to education, but it can go to after-school programs, summer camps, and recreational activities as well. So more with Section 504, it's specific to individuals with disability, but please keep in mind that it's any person with a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. So sometimes some folks may not necessarily have a medical diagnosis, but need an accommodation. For the purposes of school, what can those accommodations look like? It could be like extending time for a test, extending time to turn in a work project, preferential seating, taking a test in a different setting. Same thing for the bus. Maybe they need an accommodation in the bus because it's too loud, so they may get an accommodation. When we talk about major life activities, includes caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, working, performing manual tasks, and learning. Sometimes people don't think about it, but even migraines. If you're a migraine sufferer, you may need an accommodation. It is important to note that Section 504 does not prescribe conditions that qualify. Anything that substantially limits the major life activity is a condition that could qualify the student. Again, it's not something that's automatic, but please keep in mind that this is an option if a student does not qualify for an individual education program. Any questions so far? No? We're good? All right, so FERPA, you have something to say? So FERPA, it stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's a parent's rights and eligible students 18 and older to be able to access their school records. Schools must protect those rights, so anyone having access to that must be given permission by a parent. Connecticut does provide additional rights. It's really important to also know that notes like teachers' notes or school staff may have sent an email, those things are not going to be part of the student's record. But for example, discipline, restraint, seclusion, evaluations, the student's progress report, report cards, sometimes even work samples may be all part of that. We encourage families to ask at least once a year to review the child's records, just in case there's something in the academic file that they're not in agreement with. An example of that, my son was evaluated for supports, for additional behavior supports. And when I reviewed the evaluation in that report, there was times where my son's name had another student's name. And then there was information that was not related to my son. It's almost like they did a copy and paste. So that was one of the things I asked not to be included in my child's file because it wasn't really a good representation of my son. So sometimes we have to look at those records and don't assume that they're always going to be correct. This also protects more than just IEPs. This could also include health records. It could also include a behavioral plan. So it's really important to know. Attendance as well. Sometimes we'll see the power school information in the academic file as well. Now, once again, things that could be excluded would be like teachers' notes and personal things. States may increase protections to students beyond federal laws, and some states may not reduce protections. Connecticut has passed laws related to timelines for evaluation, suspension, restraint, and seclusion. So for example, many students from preschool to second grade had a significant number of suspension rates in Connecticut. So Connecticut passed a law, I want to say, I think in 2015 as well, that said that these students, yes, they could still be suspended, but it has to be for something really egregious. So that's an additional protection that Connecticut had passed. For restraint and seclusion, it cannot be part of a student's IEP. It has to be an emergency situation. It was a crisis. The kid is in potential danger or someone else is in potential danger. It shouldn't be part of a behavior plan for students. Age for transition, it changed. It used to be 21. I'm going to go back. Two things changed. So for transition age, it was 16 and older. A couple of years ago, they changed it to 14 and older. So that's huge. And then the other change was at graduation age, it used to be 21. And I think for the last 2 years, they changed it to now 22. But it's at the 22nd birthday. So if the birthday's in November, services stop in November. Before, when it was 21, they were able to carry it through. So that's a big change.
Can you explain that?
So it used to be that for students who were age of 16 and older, or the IEP was going to be in effect while they were turning 16, that you would start having the conversation about transition. Transition is adult life, right? What happens? However, they made the change to 14, but really any student that needs to have transition before that. So maybe a child with Down syndrome, we're going to start a lot earlier. We're not going to wait till they're 14. Or maybe a child that has medically complex needs. You don't have to wait. So the team can decide to start earlier, but at minimum, it should be starting at 14. So I'll give an example. My son's annual PPT is in May. However, he turned 14 in March. So last year when we met at that annual PPT in May, we started with transition goals because that IEP was still going to be in effect when he turned 14, even though we weren't going to have the annual until this May. So it's really important for families to know this. Obviously, we want to make sure that schools are automatically doing it, but sometimes things happen and it doesn't. But if you do have a child that you know may need a lot more time to do transition planning, you do not have to wait. But at minimum, 14 is now the age. Any questions about that? Nope. And then I also want to go back to the timelines because it's really important that it's 45 school days. It does not include weekends, holidays, for a student's initial evaluation. So if you do a referral to special education, there is a timeline that is necessary in order to evaluate the child. But not just evaluate. If the child is found eligible, then they would have to implement it within those 45 school days. So that's really important because we want to make sure that it's a comprehensive evaluation in all areas of a suspected disability. And the reason why I point this out is because sometimes students may, in addition to having some cognitive concerns and behaviors, the team may not at that time consider OT, right? For whatever reason, maybe there's issues with fine motor skills or sensory, and they just don't consider it. So we go to the table at the second PPT to discuss evaluations. The student is now found eligible. And then if the family says, hey, I just realized my son has a difficult time when he hears loud sounds. My son has a difficult time with his pictographs and how he buttons up. And then now we think about, oh, well, maybe we should have an OT evaluation. That evaluation now is reasonable time. Now it doesn't have to be within those 45 days. So that's why we want to make sure that when you are discussing your child's concerns, you bring everything up at the table through that initial so that they're able to evaluate everything at that time and it's done within those 45 days. That's something that comes to mind. Any questions about that? I know I gave a lot. So technically they have to follow it, and if they don't follow it, then it could be because the parents took time to sign off on the evaluations. So that's another thing, the evaluations require consent. Some families may choose to evaluate one thing but not evaluate another thing that the team may have suggested, or maybe they're not sure what's being evaluated and they want to consult with their primary care doctor, so that could delay the process. But they should be following the 45 days, and if they don't follow the 45 days, there's procedural safeguards, so a family can technically file a state complaint. I wouldn't necessarily start there with families, especially on an initial, like to start that relationship kind of in that tone, but families should know that at least it should be within 45 days. Keep in mind, of course, holidays, because then it'll extend that timeline. So if you do a referral, so say, for example, right now it's the spring and they do a referral, some schools will tell families, this is happening, and it's always happened, where they say, oh, you know what, Mom, it's so close to the end of the school year, why don't you wait till September? Can they have a PPT right now? This is a question. They can. Can they evaluate over the summer? They can. But sometimes districts will say to parents, oh, because it's the summer. So it may not be the same staff that works with your child, so that could be a factor, right? But if you have a child that has struggled and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the referral is now, the family decided or the school decided to make a referral to special ed in May or in June, technically they can. So it's really important for families to know that they can make the decision, even if it's a different team. I would much rather get those results in instead of waiting to the following school year, but I do know sometimes they discourage families for a late referral, spring into early summer. Any questions about that? The other things about suspension, so any student that is having multiple suspensions, so it doesn't have to be 10 consecutive days, but 10 cumulative days. If they have those 10 days, the school should be having a manifestation determination meeting to determine if this behavior is specific to the student's disability. The student does not require an IEP, by the way, for this. However, if they do have an IEP, that should also follow. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes families are being asked to pick up their child early. So I'll give my kids names. Hey, Sebastian's having a bad day today. Hey, Mom, can you come pick up Sebastian? So I say, okay, I'm going to go pick up Sebastian. And now it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Then tomorrow I get another phone call. And it's like, hey, Mom, Sebastian had a bad day. Do you think you could pick him up? Now it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I go pick up Sebastian. Technically, those are suspensions. But because they're asking me to pick up my child early, and I don't know the law, I go pick him up because I don't know any better. But anytime a student is missing 90 minutes or more, technically that's a legal suspension. So I'm encouraging parents to say, is this a suspension? Now, some parents are afraid of having suspension on their child's records, so they may say, no, I'm just going to pick them up. But you cannot be on call because your child has behavior issues, right? There has to be a plan. The school's obligated to come up with a plan. So if the student is having difficulty because of behaviors, then it's the school's responsibility to hold a meeting to decide if this student needs or requires special education services. It shouldn't be left up to the parent. However, when the parent picks up the child, they don't document that, right? So it's not a suspension. So in the future, just keep that in mind, because again, if I pick them up, let's say 3 days, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, mom, you know what? Now he's suspended for 3 days. Technically, that's 6 days. And then all of a sudden something else happens and I get to that 10-day, those initials that I picked up don't count because I don't have anything in writing that says my son was suspended. So you really want to make sure if you are being called to pick up your child early that you are clarifying, is this a suspension? If it's not a suspension, don't pick them up. Now, I know for some parents that is hard to do. So sometimes you have to factor in, you know your child's best. Try to get more details. What happened? What's going on? Because we don't want our kids to be miserable either in school if something bigger is going on. We also don't want to set the tone that every time there's a behavior, mom's picking them up. Because now it's learned behavior. I'm going to do this because I know mom's going to pick me up or whoever the designated person is. We also don't want to send that message. We also want to make sure that there's a partnership between family and school. So if there is something really going on and we need additional supports, how much better it is to come together as a team and figure this out together than sending the kid home. There's no supports at home. The parent probably has to leave early in their job. Maybe their job's at risk. Some families don't have sick days. That's the reality. So now their income's impacted. So there's all these factors that come into play. And then you could potentially make this relationship between the school and the family difficult, right? Because now the family's thinking, why isn't the school doing anything? And for the school, the kid's not here. The kid already left. We don't have to worry about this kid. But that kid has to come back to school the next day. The other thing that comes to mind is sometimes they'll ask the parent if the kid had multiple days with challenges, and then they say, you know what, mom? He had such a bad day. Why don't you just keep him home tomorrow? Maybe he just needs a day to rest. Now that's a whole day. And sometimes families don't know, and they take it in good faith. Well, I'm just going to keep him home. He's having a bad day. So I really just ask you to measure, and think about that instead of just always picking up the child. Any questions about that? Was this new information? Absolutely. So you can ask for PPT at any time. So I don't want you to think that you have to wait until you have, especially if the child has not been identified. So this should be a conversation, an ongoing conversation, because technically they should be providing SRBI or RTI, response to intervention, or SRBI, scientific research-based intervention. So any student, and this includes for behaviors, that is struggling in school, schools have a responsibility to identify. And that's usually the first step before we move straight to special education. And the reason being is because we don't want to over-identify, especially when you think of children. Like, to be fair, how many times do you hear about a child being suspended? It's usually males, and it's usually Black and brown students. So this is why it's really important that we do intervention, so we're not over-identifying. So we're not just making this student a special ed student for no reason, but we're really factoring in what's really going on, what's the function of the behavior. Did we do an FBA, the functional behavior assessment? Do we have a positive behavior intervention plan? What things are in place before we end up having to move forward with special education? Like, did we exhaust all options? Did we bring in a behaviorist to come in and observe to see what's going on? Maybe there's stuff going on in the home. Maybe there's stuff happening in school. But this is why it's really important to build on that relationship and let families know ahead of time. Absolutely. So in our website, we do have a guide to terms. And then parentcenterhub.org, which is for parent training and information, PTIs. They also have a guide to terms. And OSEP, the Office of Special Education, also has a guide to terms. So I know it's a lot of acronyms, and I am trying to get to all of them, but thank you, because yes, there's a lot of acronyms to remember.
Audience.
Thank you for that, Elaine.
See, this is the thing, I also concerned. There's not always somebody that's immediately available to come to pick. Other things work. Beginning. Actually. Their family.
So this is just the reality, right? Some schools do it well. Some teams do it well, because sometimes within the same school, depending who calls, you'll get a different response, or there's a different relationship. So I don't want to say that this is happening in a particular school district, but it just does happen. The other thing is that sometimes if a student is having challenging behaviors and the parent doesn't want to pick up the child, sometimes, depending on who the staff is, may let the family, or may tell the family, we'll call DCF, right? That is really hard for families. So DCF, Department of Children and Families, especially if the family is struggling and they can't leave their job, or they're afraid another time I have to leave early, or another time I have to miss out of work, and now you're going to call DCF. What I am going to say, usually when DCF comes for that, right, they don't really take the case, right? When they call in DCF, all they have to say is if the purpose of DCF is if they suspect neglect, it could be an educational neglect, medical neglect. But when they're calling, the kid had challenging behaviors, the parent chose not to. And then the parent shares, I've gone to the school 3 times this week. I'm going to lose my job. They will work with you, but for families who hear they're gonna call DCF, that's like an immediate rupture to that family. So before school staff or whoever's calling, because it could be a preschool program, is making a reference to DCF, they really should be looking at what other supports are available for this family, what are the supports that we can provide in school, connect them to community resources before thinking DCF as a next step. But it does happen. So thank you. So this is specific to IDEA. So there's Part C, which is birth to 3, or known for birth to 3, ages 0 to 3. But it focuses on the family, and the students would get an individual family service plan, so IFSP. It's usually done in the family's natural environments. It could also be provided in a family childcare, a daycare setting, so anywhere that's a natural environment for that family. It could be at grandma's house as well. And the services are provided through Birth to 3. So Birth to 3 is the umbrella, and then there's different agencies that provide those services. And the reason why I point that out is because sometimes if you ask a family, are you getting Birth to 3 services? They are, and you ask which agency, they say, I don't know. So it's really important for families to know that. And then Part B is the school district. So ages 3 to 22, it focuses on the child. It's an individual education program in the least restrictive environment. Services are provided through the local education agency. So we're in New Haven, it would be New Haven Board of Ed. Any questions about that? No? So least restrictive environments. So for special ed purposes, we really want students to be included in all opportunities available to them. So usually for the purposes of special ed, we really want students to try to be in a regular classroom with typical peers. However, if their disability is such that it impacts their ability to be in a regular classroom, then they look at what other options may be available. It could be a self-contained classroom within the school building. It may require an out-of-district placement. However, we really want families to think about how can this student remain in their school community, be exposed to typical peers, have opportunities to be involved in their school community, so participating at recess, participating in art, the science fair, all the different activities that the school offers in the least restrictive environment. Maybe they need a one-to-one para in order to participate. Maybe half their day is going to be in a self-contained classroom and half the day is going to be in a regular setting. Or maybe it's a 50-50 classroom. But that's usually what we want. That's what the law says, but we want to encourage families. And the reason why I point that out is because sometimes families, if the child has a particular disability, maybe it's Down syndrome or autism, they naturally think that the child needs to be in a self-contained setting. So we want to move away from that idea because that's not what's going to determine the student's placement. What's going to determine the placement is the student's needs. So depending on what the student needs, if they need something more restrictive, then the team will have a discussion and propose that during their meeting. Parents are also part of the team, so of course we want parent feedback, but we shouldn't start necessarily in a self-contained or out-of-district placement. So this is what the law says specific to IDEA. This is the purpose: to ensure that all students with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services, designated to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So it's really important for families to know that even though their child may be 3 or 4 or 10, that IEP is helping them for adult life. They're really preparing them for life after school. So the 3 areas that the law says that they can be working on is post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. They don't have to work on all 3. They are required to at worst work on 2 of those. However, if you're working on 2, why not just add the other one? And usually the one that gets left out is independent living. But students with special needs still have to have good time management, organizational skills. They still have to show up at work on time. They can't just decide, oh, it's raining outside, I'm not going to work, because there was accommodations that was made in high school. So we really want all of our kids to be well-rounded. Any questions about that? No? We move on. So these are the basic principles of IDEA. So a free, appropriate public education. Where families get stuck at sometimes is that appropriate. What is appropriate? What does appropriate look like? What may work for one student may not work for another student. I mentioned the least restrictive environment already. Appropriate evaluations, all areas of a suspected disability. So it's really important for families to really think outside of the diagnosis. So for example, if a student's been diagnosed with ADHD, what are the characteristics specific to your child? Don't just say ADHD. Or maybe it's autism, but what does that look like for your child? Or cerebral palsy, right? We just don't want to make sure families are not just using the medical terms, but not thinking about how is this impacting my child? Or what is this going to look like in a classroom setting? So for example, my son has autism, right? Well, one of his things is he has a hard time with transitions. I have to be able to say that, loud noises. So there was a time, especially when there was transitions when he got a little older into middle school, and they would have to change from one classroom to the next, he would stand off to the side and wait for the entire hallway to be clear before he can walk through. But he was always getting in trouble because he was coming late to class. Not the first class, but any class after that. So those are things that we have to be mindful, right? It's going to look different for different kids. And then there's other kids that may have, also with autism, that may not be an issue for them, but they need a different type of accommodation. Maybe it's about social skills, or maybe there's something else sensorial, right? They may need headsets or something when they're going through those transitions from one classroom to the next. Anything you want to add? If you have an example, feel free. No? Sure. I want to make sure I understand. Can you say it again? And when you say support, specifically to
Awareness.
about disability?
Yeah.
All right. So the question is if there's resources for families who have children in special ed. No. So that's a good question. So that would be work, that would be a team effort. We're really understanding that individual student's needs. So if it's something about the environment, so there is, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there is a specific assessment that can be done in a classroom setting to look at these things. So for example, if a student is struggling with sensorial stuff, is it the lighting? Is it sound? Is it about the orientation in the classroom? So for some kiddos that have issues with proprioception, how they center themselves. So we have kids that have that as an issue. So maybe, the desks need to be further apart, or the layout of the classroom needs to have more space to walk about. So yes, they can technically do an assessment to look at that classroom setting. Did I answer your question? Okay.
And I'll keep listening.
But Sally, yes, I'm going to try. So Sally gave an example about how families can support other families who have kids with special needs. So one of the things she mentioned was about a school trip, trying to be more inclusive. If they're walking, trying to create a pathway. But it goes back to those partnerships between school and families. So one of the things that comes to mind is usually either during circle time, or maybe schools offer like a share. Families can come into the school, or maybe that could be part of a student's self-advocacy goal to talk about their disability and the impact of their disability. Obviously, this may be for a little older kiddos, but I had my kids, two of my children that were participants of Birth to 3, they were at their PPTs at 3 years old. So their self-advocacy started really young. I mean, when you think about what can a 3-year-old do, well, you can ask him his name. You can ask him what TV show he likes, his favorite color. And then they're able to see the child right then and there, and not a piece of paper with my kid's name, but this is who Sebastian is. This is who Christian is. And they're able to see their challenges up front and center versus one snapshot because you evaluated my kid in a multidisciplinary team. Here you get to see him in action. So those are things that come to mind, but also how schools are incorporating, maybe they have like a lunch buddy, this is another opportunity, or a lunch bunch, and then they have opportunities for typical peers to be with students either in special ed or maybe with 504 accommodations so that they feel integrated, and then creating other opportunities throughout the school day. So this is why it's really important that we try first in a least restrictive setting, because we have had some kiddos that are in self-contained classrooms. If they're in a regular school setting, they bring these kids up, and I say up because sometimes they're on the first floor, so that they're able to participate in recess, gym, art, music, and they do have those opportunities to be with typical peers and not just automatically exclude them.
I would strongly recommend, oh, this is wonderful, this is exciting. For future in-person, I would like to make a formal request that there be roving mic available at the park. Because that equips us amongst ourselves when we organize a roaming mic. Whoever can act around to get.
Thank you. So Ms. Lane wants to emphasize the use of the mic. So I apologize we don't have one, but I'll try to do my best. So the last one is procedural safeguards. It's really important for families to know that they do have procedural safeguards. A lot of times families don't realize what's the next step. So things that come to mind for families is they can request mediation, they can have a due process. Usually that would be more like the last step. They can have a facilitated IEP meeting. It may be a new term for some of you, but if school districts and families are not able to come to a common ground before initiating mediation, they may be able to get a neutral party paid by the district to come in and help facilitate. They're not the decision makers, but they're really there to help facilitate the conversation, and sometimes that is a good opportunity. Sally, you were going to say something? No? So I don't have it here, but we could definitely put something together. It's CAD. So what Sally wanted to point out is that for IEP facilitation, there is a good website called Cadre, and it's CADRE. I don't know what the website is, but that's the name of it. So she thinks it's cadre.org, but it's a good resource to families, and they also have a lot of information about dispute resolution. So it is a good place for look for information. These are key points in the law. These are requirements for students with disabilities, that an appropriate evaluation in all areas of suspected disabilities to identify their unique needs for students suspected of having disabilities. I have said this, and I keep emphasizing because it's really important. This is what really drives the student's individual educational program, so this is why an appropriate evaluation is necessary. A free appropriate public education, that is designated to meet their unique needs. Remember that appropriate could look different from one student to another. It is a term that is unique to each child and may often be a place of disagreement about what is appropriate. So really having those conversations and having a strong relationship with the school team to really try to iron out those concerns. Have the right to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate for them. And this is what's known as the least restrictive environment for that student. Any questions about that? No? Additionally, students with disabilities are served through an individualized education program known as the IEP, which is a written plan of services to be delivered and represents FAPE, free appropriate public education, in the least restrictive environment. Have their IEP developed at a planning and placement team meeting known as a PPT, where the parent and student, as appropriate, is an equal member. It's really important for families to feel like they are members of the team. It should never feel like it's us against them. And when I say us, referring to myself as a parent. So things that the school team can really do to engage families and feel like they're equal members. If the family speaks a different language, did we take the time to identify that? Did we take the time to ensure that we have an effective interpreter? Do we have a system to evaluate that interpreter to ensure effective interpretation? Did we translate documents for the family? When you think of procedural safeguards, do you have it available in that parent's language? If you don't have it available in that parent's language, do you have someone that can explain it to them before the meeting? Or maybe, preferably before the actual date of the meeting, but even, if the meeting is scheduled for 9 o'clock, maybe say come a half hour early. But it's really important that we take the time to figure out who needs this. You'd be surprised how many times I've gone to PPTs, families Spanish speaking, there's no interpreter. And then they'll say, oh, I didn't know mom needed an interpreter. And it was like, yeah. And it was like, but I've talked to mom in the past. Well, being able to talk conversationally and being able to comprehend and understand jargon specific to the law about special education, totally different thing. So we just really want to be mindful and not assume. Have a set of procedural safeguard rights, which include steps to resolve disagreements as outlined in the law. Sorry, Gretchen. So Gretchen points out that I've pointed out that I'm talking more about the school's responsibility. But she wants to encourage that families also do the homework. So yes, by parent request, this is what's in the law. If the family wants, so for example, the family's now been found eligible for special ed, they have no idea what special ed is. By parent request, they could ask for parent training and information counseling. I will say this, parents don't know that. So they can't ask for what they don't know. And some families have barriers. They have their own cognitive limitations. So we want to point that out. They may have their own disabilities. So we do want to encourage families to prepare themselves as much as possible. We're one agency, but there's other agencies throughout the state of Connecticut that can provide support and resources. Favor comes to mind. Children's Center for Advocacy comes to mind. And there may be others. No, that's fine. No, I'm good.
Is available to not. Why not? So I actually struggle to figure out and graduated on this throughout the entire time. But that happens 12th grade year to the freshman year.
So this is a great question, and it's specific to transition. So for students that have completed, right, have completed high school and move on to college. So that's in summary. So I'm going to say yes and no. The reason why I say that is that's why the age requirement for transition has changed. Now instead of 16, it's 14. Once again, I'm going to repeat, 14 is what the law is saying. However, if a student needs more time to work on specific areas, they can start much earlier than that. Students, I want to say in 6th grade has the student success plan. I don't know if you know this is regular ed students. So think about that. Maybe that's part of the conversation to have with your child's school, right? You know, what does my student success plan look for my child, and how can we incorporate this as part of transition planning? With transition planning, it's really important to understand if the family decide to accept a diploma because the student has received all of their high school credits, they are no longer able to receive support services through an IEP, right? So it's really important that families are informed that their rights to special education will end. It's also important to note that when they design the IEP, there are things to consider, and the team has to consider, is the student going to complete their program of special ed at 18, right? Because they turned that age and they've completed the high school credits, when they no longer need special ed services, or at 22, right? So they give those options. Start the conversation early, because if you have a child, and I'll give an example of my son, he's now 20, he'll be 21 in June. He does have a diagnosed disability of autism, along with ADHD, along with anxiety. As his mother, I made the choice of not going to court to pursue guardianship. However, we do have a good relationship, and it's important to say that, because when we go to PPTs, he lets them know I still want my mom to make decisions for me for educational purposes, and this is why he still has an IEP. However, depending on who's talking to him, there's times where he's saying, I'm done, I don't want special ed services, right? And then as his mother, I'm like, no, because they're gonna be able to support you and you can get extra help. This doesn't always happen with families. There's some kids that have an IEP for ADHD, and they may benefit from that extra year of transition. Maybe you're gonna work on specific skills. However, if the student did not have a good relationship with their high school, maybe they just feel like they're done and through, and now the student is 18, transfer of rights happens at 18, that student can now make educational decisions and may say, you know what, I'm done with school, I'm out of here, and it doesn't matter what mom says. So this is why it's important to start the conversation early, because what students don't realize, that transition supports don't have to happen at the high school. They can happen in another environment. But what kids think is, oh, I'm gonna stay in this school, I don't wanna stay here, because they want to transition like their peers. So if they have other peers that are moving on to employment, moving on to college, maybe it's a trade program, and they feel like I'm gonna stay back another year, without really understanding you're not staying back. You're gonna work on transition on specific things, and it may be a different program. Gateway has a Step Forward program. Norwalk Community College has another program. So there's college programs for kids that are going through transition. Obviously, it is a conversation that happens at the PPT, and if that's what you're thinking as far as transition planning, because you want your child to go to college, start the conversation as early as possible. Maybe part of that transition planning could include college courses while they're a high school student. How are they able to manage those college courses? What are those challenges? Because remember, for college, they can get accommodations through the 504. They're not going to have accommodations through an IEP. So they're not going to be able to have the same support. The other thing that comes to mind is if a student has always had a para all the way through 12th grade, and now the student transitions to college, they're not going to have a para. They may be able to get a note taker, but that's not going to be able to provide the same support they may have gotten as a high school student or middle school student. So we want to try to encourage families to think about which path, especially if they're thinking of post-secondary education, because it's really hard for kids to have that support staff person that's always been with them now no longer be a part of their day-to-day. So you want to start thinking about when is the right time, when it is appropriate for this student to no longer require this, and at what point do we reduce that support? Because that's really hard for some families to let go of that extra set of hands and eyes. Any questions about that? Did I answer your question? Because the other thing that comes to mind is the disability office. So any student that's really looking to go to college, you should be reaching out to that school's disability office at least 6 months in advance, because one, you have to submit paperwork to prove your disability, two, to talk about those accommodations, and if they need to get you a particular device, I think about augmentative communication, or maybe they need to get you a particular type of book or something because of your disability, maybe it's a visual disability, they need enough time to be able to get these things in place for you. Gretchen? So for students that are having transition, especially depending on the age, because 14 may be too soon to include BRS, but 16, because of their Level Up program, they can always be invited. And the school doesn't have to be the only ones to invite. Families can also invite BRS to be a part of their child, or any other person that they feel knows the student or can share information about additional supports for a student. Level Up is one option for students that are going through transition. It's an opportunity to have some job shadowing, some work experience. They should be tailoring it based on the student's interests. However, sometimes it doesn't always work that way. My son did Level Up, and he got a job at Walgreens. But what I liked, because that was his first real work experience, and he was getting his little check, so he was excited, was that he had a support staff person. And so when he was messing up, even though he didn't think he was messing up, so for example, he chose that he was going to work after school. What he didn't realize was the impact, how that was going to impact him. So he would decide, I'm not going to go today because I'm tired. And it's like, don't you have to go to your program? Like, don't you go? He was like, no, because I'm tired today. It was like, that's a real job. He's like, no, they're okay. He still has to learn. No, I need to call. So then I said, what do you think would be better? Don't you want to do your hours instead over the weekend? He's like, oh, I could do that? So yes, you can actually do that. He was like, so who do I let know? So I definitely let him know that he can talk to his worker through the Level Up program, but also be responsible and reach out to the folks at Walgreens where he was working at to say, hey, this schedule really doesn't work for me. And then he was a much better employee because now he was going to work. It was longer hours, Saturday and Sunday, but he didn't have the commitment of going to school and then having to work the 4 hours. But he just didn't have the foresight to think, I should let somebody know. In his head, oh, it's no big deal. They set it up for me. I still have a job. In the real world, you can't do that. You can't just no call, no show, you're fired. But those are those skills, right, that working with Level Up or some program designed for students that need that level of support can be helpful. You know, how to come to an interview. I remember another interview he went to, he was in jeans. It was like, why are you going in jeans? He's like, oh, it's just at the movies. No, it's a first impression. You have to go correct. So those are conversations that it doesn't have to be just a student with a disability. It could be any student because they just don't have the executive function deficits or skills to be able to do that. My kid has deficits in that area. So those are great conversations because he was able to do job shadow interview in school, skills, techniques, how to write a resume, how to talk during an interview. And one of the things that comes up in an application is if you self-disclose having a disability. That was a whole conversation with him. So he was afraid about disclosing if he had a disability. So we did talk about that, but Gretchen is saying no. So Gretchen has shared that through the American Disabilities Act, they discourage it because of discrimination that's done with folks with disabilities. Sure. Oh, I thought it did. Bureau of Rehabilitation Services.
That's okay. Not everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're doing a great
Absolutely.
job.
So any questions about that? No? Okay, so we'll move on to the next. So these are IDA mandates that the process for how decisions are made, identifying student needs and strengths through evaluation. We want to make sure that schools are using more than just one tool, one assessment, developing measurable goals based on evaluation, planning relevant services to meet those needs, instruction, related services. So what does related services look like? That could be occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech. It could also include transportation, applied behavior analysis, so maybe they need ABA, supplementary aids, and any additional services that they may need. It could include a one-to-one para. Deciding where students will receive services, so are they going to be getting services as push-in, meaning special ed teachers coming into the classroom? Will they be pulled out? They're going to be pulled into a resource room or another setting, or are they going to be in a self-contained classroom? And for some students, they may need an out-of-district placement. Then implementation and progress monitoring. How is this going to look like for the student? What is the frequency, duration of the services that they get? This is Child's Find. So IDEA requires that all school districts locate, identify, and evaluate any students with disabilities in their district. So this is a responsibility that schools have. So yes, for those students that are having some challenges academically, maybe they're struggling as a reader, maybe there's some behavior challenges, schools should be implementing that SRBI practice, monitoring these students. Actually, the SRBI provides heavy progress monitoring because they have to assess these students. And then there's different tiered levels of intervention. So at tier 1, they need a little bit of help. It's done in the classroom. Tier 2, we need to beef this up a little bit more. Between a tier 2 and a tier 3, technically that's specialized instruction. That should be a prompt referral to special ed. Please know that any student that is getting interventions, they should not be denied or delayed from being evaluated. Sometimes school will say, you know what, Mom? They're getting intervention services. We're going to wait a little longer. We need to collect more data. The law does not say that, right? However, we do recognize, at least give them some time to put some strategies in place to kind of see if this is about instruction, if this is about exposure, right? Maybe this is a student that didn't have preschool experience, starting kindergarten, now is struggling. Or maybe they come from a different country, or maybe they have significant absences. So we do want to give them their time, but if a student's been a tier 2 intervention or tier 3 for more than a year, I have concern with that. And we haven't evaluated, and you don't want to evaluate, I have a concern with that. Any questions about that? Nope. On to the next one. This is timeline for eligibility. So keep this in mind. They have to, Connecticut Red says 45 school days, but under IDA, they say 60 days. But I want to point out that Connecticut is less. This, again, does not include the time for parents to give consent. They have to complete these steps within those 45 days, hold the initial PPT to determine if evaluations are necessary, to complete evaluation. Student may be getting SRBI, so they can use that data as part of what they use to evaluate the student's needs for special ed. Hold a second PPT to review the evaluation and determine if the student is eligible for services. If the student is determined eligible, they should be developing and implementing that IEP within that 45 days. Any questions about that? So the next one is the eligibility criteria must have a disability. For the purposes of special ed, they don't require a medical diagnosis, so please keep that in mind. However, there are 13 classifications for a student to qualify for special ed services. The disability must impact their education, so maybe they do have a medical diagnosis, but there's no academic impact. So just because they have a medical diagnosis doesn't mean they're going to qualify for special ed. And the other thing is that they require specialized instruction in order to benefit from the curriculum. It's really important that they have an appropriate identification because, again, you want to rule out these things. You know, if it's a lack of appropriate instruction, maybe the primary teacher has been out and there's been a substitute teacher, so maybe that there's a gap in instruction. You want to make sure that you have, again, that comprehensive evaluation. You want to be able to look at what was the process used for identification through RTI. And again, cannot be a reason to deny or delay evaluation if they are getting those interventions. Once eligibility has been determined, I mentioned the 13 classifications, and now I will show you what that looks like. So they really have to look at the primary. I do want to point out that number 4, emotional disability, it was previously known as emotional disturbance. That has changed, I think, within the last year, so we're happy about that because many families, if the child was going to be found eligible under emotional disturbance, they really did not like that. So sometimes they would decline getting services because of that. So I'm happy that they changed it to emotional disability. Again, they really want to look at what is the student's primary disability, and there's checklists available for these. So it's really important for families to know that maybe the student, so for example, my son has a medical diagnosis of autism. He also has a diagnosis of ADHD. For the purposes of special ed, he would fall under other health impairment, OHI, ADD, ADHD. For him, his IEP, because according to the team, his impact is more the ADHD, not the autism. And that is okay. I just want my kid to get services. The classification isn't going to drive the IEP or the services that he gets. His present levels of academic and functional performance, it's what's going to determine the supports my child gets. For some families, that's really hard, especially for kiddos 3 to 5. If the child does have a medical diagnosis of autism and the school then says developmental delay, they're not understanding why. Developmental delay is still appropriate, but keep in mind it is specific to that age group, ages 3 to 5. Again, it should not change the services that kids get. However, I have seen sometimes that if a student is getting an IEP for ADHD, they may argue that the student doesn't qualify for ABA. So it's really helping the team understand it's not about that classification, it's really what the student needs. Any questions about that? No? Okay, move on to the next. So I mentioned this in regards to the developmental delay, ages 3 to 5. And then for Connecticut's IEP, they have added deafness listed as hearing impairment, deaf or hard of hearing, the emotional disability, which was changed. And then we have the additional categories on the IEP, which is specific learning disability with dyslexia. And then they also have the OHI for other health impairments. And this is Connecticut. So IDEA does not include these. And moving on to continuing the IDEA is these components are applied through the IEP process and created at PPT meetings. So that evaluation, it's a multidisciplinary team. What are we going to look at? What are we going to evaluate? What are those concerns? It's going to be where they're going to determine eligibility, and that's where they're going to develop the student's IEP, which is the individual education program. If there's a new referral, this must occur within the 45 school day timeline. For students with existing IEPs, the date of implementation on Connecticut's IEP can be found on prior written notice. I want to point out that as of July 1st, 2022, Connecticut now has a new IEP. Really important for you to know that. For some students, they may, so my son's annual, as I mentioned, is not until May, so he still has his previous IEP document. Starting May for him, he will get the new document. The reason why I want to point that out is because in the previous document, prior written notice was on page 3. In the current document, it is a separate document. So if you see the handouts that I brought with you, I included the current prior written notice as a handout so that, one, you can see what it looks like, because now it's separate, and two, understand that it is now a separate document. And that's really important because prior written notice allows families to see how decisions are being made. So if something's denied, they can't just say, well, we don't do that as a district, or we don't have funding for that. No, they actually have to say why they made this determination. What did they use to determine that the child does not need this, or maybe that the child does need this? And when is this going to be implemented? So who should be at the PPT? At least one of the student's general education teachers, the student's special education teacher. If it's a new IEP, right, so the student may not already have a designated special ed, but more than likely he would be assigned to the student. Someone who is knowledgeable about evaluations. This could include the social worker, school psychologist, student's parent or primary caregiver, a school administrator. That's the person who's going to commit to the resources, the student if appropriate, and other providers. So if you're working with an agency, families should be able to bring those folks to the table. If the child has a therapist or maybe they're working with ICAPS, they can invite them to the PPT. It's really important that parents know that they're equal members. Students should be invited to their PPT. How much younger, however, for Connecticut, they usually start inviting them about age 14. I want my kids there at the table early on, because if you wait till they're 14, what do you think is going to happen? They won't go. They don't know how to participate. They're not sure how they can speak up. Now, when students participate, keep in mind, participation could look different depending on the student. So maybe the student doesn't want to use their voice, but they're comfortable putting something in writing. Or maybe you want to record your child and have a statement, right, that the school team can look at. I have seen teams create PowerPoints and support the student in creating the PowerPoint, introducing the student. So they can get creative, and this way it minimizes how much the student has to participate. My 14-year-old, we just had a PPT to discuss some things that were happening with him because they owed him hours, and he was like, do I have to go to this meeting? I was like, technically, you don't have to go to this meeting. He was like, I prefer not to go. Because we were just going to discuss if the hours were met, it wasn't really going to be about details specific to evaluations. I didn't care to have him. However, for May, it's his annual, but it's also his triennial, which means we're going to be reviewing evaluations. I want him to be a part of that, especially because now he's transitioning to high school. So it's really important for him to know and hear, because I have been the parent advocating for a teenager. And my son, Christian, they had given him a pass. Remember I said he had anxiety? So usually when he has a lot of anxiety, he starts to open and close his hands and pace back and forth and open and close his hands. So here we are, annual is in May. His also happens to be in May. And my son had never used this pass they had given him. So anytime he needed a sensory break, he would be able to show the pass. My son never used it. So the school's complimented, oh, Christian never used it. I don't think we should keep this. I was like, well, did he know when he needed to use it? Because he doesn't. But you kept calling me multiple times because of behaviors. Right? So here he is towards the end of 9th grade, and his special ed teacher says, Christian, you needed me to tell you when you needed a break? And Christian goes, and he's like, now I'm 4'11", he's 6 feet tall. So they're like, Christian, as big as you are, you need me to tell you when you need a break? And Christian's like, they asked him 3 times. I was like, this isn't coming from me. He doesn't know, because I kept asking him, are you using your break pass? Why are they calling me for behaviors? You're supposed to get a sensory break. You're supposed to be doing this. And he was like, no, I'll use it. He just never had the awareness. Remember I talked about proprioceptive knowing? So he just didn't know when his body needed the break. So when he would get a break was when he would have to get exited from the classroom because of behaviors. Had they taught him explicitly when to use that pass, it could have reduced the amount of times he had to be taken out. So those are simple things, but this is why it's important for him to be a part of the conversation, because that probably would have never revealed itself during that. I have a friend whose son is legally blind, hearing impaired, has hearing aids, has cerebral palsy, significant needs. Her concerns has always been his hearing loss, right? And because he's at his PPT, when they're talking about his accommodations, what he was concerned about was the visual. And he wanted his team to know that, I said he has cerebral palsy, so he has mobility challenges. But what I will say that was great, because he was like 11, was that he's told his mom is, I don't want them to hold me when we're going to walk in the hallways. I want to be able to hold them. That was a revelation for her. Because they're always talking about what he needed. But it didn't happen until the PPT, for whatever reason, that came up for him. And that was a great conversation because it changed accommodations that mom even said, I didn't even know that that was a thing for him. I just kept thinking he's missing information, he's missing information. So again, please include kids as much as possible. They don't have to stay the whole session. I get it. It's really hard to sit through evaluations that sometimes point out challenges, deficits. But it's important for students to know that they have these things, but that they have these supports. Too often you ask a student about their accommodations, they don't know what they are. And they have these accommodations, so if they don't know what their accommodations are, how can they exercise their right to say, hey, I get extra time on this test? Or hey, it's really hard to sit through this right now, can I go to a different space? And I don't want to say that it's all the teacher's fault, because sometimes teachers may not go through all of these accommodations. So you want to be able to let your kid know, hey, you have these things available to you. The one that I usually don't like kids to know is, because I really want to emphasize to set high expectation for kids, is if they do have modification about homework. So if this is a student that has significant needs, then maybe there is a modification for grading, right? So they're not going to be graded on turning in homework, so they don't have to. But I still want my kid to get homework. I still want my kid to be exposed. I still want him, especially if the plan could potentially be college, I have to prepare him for work study. I have to prepare him that you have to develop these study habits early on. You don't wait until you decide, oh, at 18, I think I want to try college. No, these skills start a lot younger. So that's the only one that I don't care to let students know, because they'll take advantage. But just keep that in mind. I mentioned about rights, being the transfer rights at 18. Schools must make an effort to ensure attendance. So if students are missing, what's going on? What's happening, what supports does the student need in order to go to school. Last year, I want to say July also, I don't know if you know this, they did make some changes for students to get school virtually from 9th grade to 12th grade if they needed that. And this year they were going to change it K through 12. So keep that in mind. The other thing I want to point out is that there was changes that students can get up to 2 per year mental health days. My kids have taken advantage of their mental health days. And we want to honor that. If they're having a hard time, and especially if you have a kid that's mostly, like I know my son who's on the spectrum, he's a kid that cannot miss any day. So on Mondays where it's a holiday, it is hard for him. Because in his head, I'm supposed to go to school. So when he has said he's needed a mental health day, I know he needs a moment. So I just want to point that out because those are excused. So yes, we do have it, but I did not bring it. So she's pointing out specifically to prior written notice. So technically, Connecticut not only developed a new IEP, they also have a new system, Connecticut Special Ed Data Systems, Connecticut SEDS. So they are translating, or supposed to be, up to the 10 most spoken languages in Connecticut. Now, it's really important to note, because there's been glitches, they have to identify the family's language, and then they will be able to get their documents in that language. So if they don't enter Spanish, then through their parent portal, they may get an English document. So if they are getting documents in English, because it is happening, then we want to ensure that whoever is entering the data makes sure that they identify that family's language. And then that would include the IEP, that would include prior written notice, notice of meeting, because that's a new document that came out. So anything that they give. Now, if it's evaluations, that's not done through that data system, so that the school would have to figure out when they're going to do that. However, yes, families can ask for their evaluations under Title VI, it's a civil rights law, to have their evaluations translated into their language so that they can be meaningful participants at their child's planning and placement team meeting. Any questions about that? Oh, wait, I don't think I said this. Schools must make every effort to include parent input and parent and student as well. So it's really important for you guys to know that in the new document of the IEP, under each section, so before, you would have in the previous document pages 4 and 5 of present levels. And on the top of page 4, they would have parent and student input, right? So this is what I shared, this is what my kids shared, and they would have it there. Now in the new document, they're gonna have it under each section. So if I have concerns about academics, parent and student input concerns will be there. If it's about communication, parent input and concerns is gonna be there. So it's actually nicer than having to go back and forth between pages, but obviously, it's going to be a learning curve to get to know your new document if you haven't seen it already. The other thing I want to point out about the new document is you're only going to see the sections that apply. So if the student is not of transition age, you will not see information about transition. Any questions about that? No? So we move on to the next. So IEP, it's an individualized program designed to meet the student's unique needs in order to benefit from the general education curriculum. It is the centerpiece of IDEA. It is a written plan that details each student's special education and related services. It must be reviewed at least annually, must be written for all students receiving special education. Important to know that it is a legal document. So if the school is saying we're going to be offering XYZ, it should be written in the document. The other thing that goes under related services, parent training and counseling. I have had districts say, oh, well, we don't offer that here. Well, IDEA says that you do, right? And that's gonna look different for different kiddos. I've had schools say, oh, but you ask for this every year. Absolutely, because students have needs, right? Every year, and those needs could look different. So maybe I need support in using my child's augmentative communication device this year, but maybe next year my kid now has these new behaviors and I need to address that, and I need support to address that. So please know, again, you have to ask for it. They're not necessarily always gonna offer it to you. If they do say, oh, you know what, Mom, we can meet with you. When do you wanna meet? And the parent agrees, okay, I wanna meet every 6 weeks. It should be included in the IEP. If it's not in the IEP and then you say, oh, well, you said you were going to meet with me every 6 weeks and we're not meeting, and then you decide you want to file a state complaint, is it going to work? Not documented, it's as if it never happened. So any conversation that you think is valuable and you want to make sure, like another thing that comes to mind is communication. You know, sometimes families agree on a specific timeline. I'm going to get a communication every Friday. And then Fridays keep coming and going, you don't have any communication. If it's not documented, they didn't violate anything. So you want to make sure that it's in the document. This is a QR code. This is going to bring you specific. If you have your phones out, you can go straight into our website and you'll be able to access information about the IEP. And if you scroll down, you'll have information about Connecticut SEDS, which is the new data system, along with the new IEP. So I don't know if you want to take the time to take a picture. If not, we'll move on. But you do have access to the presentation and the QR code is there. And then FAPE in the least restrictive environment. First consideration is for services to be provided, again, in the general ed classroom with supplemental supports and services in the school where the student would ordinarily attend, if not disabled. So again, we really want to emphasize that. And the reason why I say that is because families sometimes don't realize when they're saying they want a small classroom setting, what is that impact for your child, right? It's going to look different for one kid to the next. So maybe your child doesn't identify as a student with special needs. And now they go into a self-contained classroom with kids that are nonverbal, that have probably limited communication skills, maybe in a wheelchair. I'm not saying they can't be exposed to that, But if your child had challenges with communication and now you put them in this environment, it may limit their communication. Or maybe they're in this setting and they have different age groups. You know, sometimes it's 3 years lower and 3 years older. Sometimes I've seen them 5 years older. So if you have a 5-year-old with a kid that's 10, for some families, that may be scary. But self-contained classrooms, that's another thing. Self-contained classrooms, the number of class size, it's just appropriate. There's nothing that says it has to be 6 kids or it has to be 10 kids. They do try to limit that class size, but sometimes I've seen self-contained classrooms with 15 kids. So we really want to be able to look at that. So is your child going to have a good peer match group? Is it going to be harder or easier in this class environment? So I know for my son, when he was younger, it was a great environment. As he got older, being in the self-contained setting, he didn't appreciate that. He kept saying, I want to be like the other kids. I want to be like the other kids. And as they get older and they have this awareness, it's really important that we honor that. But he did need support. So at that time, he was getting 14.75 hours of special ed. So he did need a lot of support. Any questions? So we're almost done. So FAPE, what does it look like? Special classes could be separate schooling or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. This is coming directly from IDA. These are the regs. So we really want to be mindful of which students are being identified for self-contained classrooms. Just because they have Down syndrome, that doesn't necessarily mean they go to a self-contained classroom. They could be with kids that are non-disabled. Procedural safeguard rights. Parents must receive this at least annually. It should be available to them in their language. If it cannot be provided entirely in their language, someone should be made available to go over it with them in their language. This could be done through the language line. There's some languages that they may not be able to find an interpreter locally, but they should be able to have access to that information. They have a right to an independent educational evaluation, also known as an IEE. So if the family gets an evaluation, they're not in agreement with the findings of that evaluation, they can ask at district expense to have an evaluation by someone else. It should be in the same area, so if I have concerns about their psych ed evaluation, then I should have another psych ed evaluation. If it was done by a psychologist, then it should be done by a psychologist. It cannot be that I have concerns about this psych ed evaluation, but then I end up getting an OT, right? Sometimes parents don't know this. So there has to be. They can't be more than 75 miles from where they live, and the going rate, so for example, if they're charging $3,000, this person can't say I'm going to charge $5,000. Schools sometimes do have a list of providers that they've worked with. Sometimes that could be a little sketchy for families, so families are encouraged, if you're not comfortable using the school's list, that you can get your own person. Then these are procedural safeguards. You can file a state complaint, you can request mediation. Mediation is voluntary, so both parties have to agree. Same thing with facilitated IEP meetings, both parties have to agree. And then the next step is due process. You're not required to have an attorney for due process. However, your lack of information is not going to excuse you. So usually districts have an attorney, and there's a specific way that you file and specific things that you have to do to submit your exhibits in a timely manner. If you don't follow that, then you can't say, well, I didn't know. So this is why then we say you should have an attorney. So how did we do? Lots of info. So this is our contact information. So if you have any questions, again, you have this. If you picked up a packet, feel free to call the agency if you have any questions, if you need any support. And that's pretty much it.
Lift this up a little bit. No, I'm not. Can we give it up for Keo? And really just taking us through this in-depth, answering questions in real time. We really appreciate you. Can we give it up for Miss Joy, Miss Linda, interpreting for us? We want to give a special shout out to our sponsors. We're so happy to be here at the New Haven Free Public Library, the Mitchell branch. Reporting live from Westville, the National Endowment for the Arts, in partnership with Arts Midwest, the David Landrock Foundation, and the City of New Haven. We have free copies of Sitting Pretty for folks. If you don't have your copy, please feel free to grab one. There are also free copies at each and every New Haven Free Public Library across the city. This was just phenomenal, but this is not our last hoorah. Catch us again May 10th at the Stetson Library. We will be having a conversation on love, dating, and disability. Thank you all for coming out.